That is what I think I cherish most about
I'm
you.
not sure, Krabby. That's actually a really interesting conversation right now.
But before we
I think
get into your
Apu is problematic because there was no other representation of Indian people on mainstream television. So when the only representation you have is a problematic stereotype and trope, or an archetype of an amalgam of stereotypes, that's problematic. So I'm not sure whether they will or not. I think if you make Apu more of a dynamic character going forward, that might solve it. But it is an interesting conversation. That's the thing is like, I mean, so admittedly, I never watched The Simpsons. So I've only ever seen like the examples of Apu that are like, stereotypical and like where he's sort of talked down to. So so take what I say with a grain of salt as it relates to Apu, but I think any time that there's little representation of a certain group, and then the representation that is there is a stereotype or is is kind of boxed in. I think that's there needs to be more of a dynamic representation of anybody, I think. But Apu is indeed successful. Then you get into the whole like societal bias towards the idea that if you work at a convenience store you're somehow lowly. I very much prefer to listen to the people who feel connected to some form of how Apu represents an aspect of their identity than I am to people who do not have that connection to Apu. So I think any person whose identity is sort of represented in that way, where they would look at Apu and say, I feel that this is a strong aspect of my identity that's being represented, and I'm not really a fan of the way that it's being represented, I'm always listening to a person that says that. This is not really my call to make whether Apu is representative in a good way or not, because Apu does not really represent any aspect of my identity. But then again, as being a cis white hetero dude, I am dynamically represented in just about every single context there is, so I don't ever have to worry about the way I'm represented. Well, the thing about the white stereotypes, though, is that despite the fact that they might have used stereotypes, they used many. So there was still a level of being dynamic. Like, white people are still far more dynamically represented than pretty much any other minority groups. I mean, ultimately, stereotypes are not like... stereotypes are usually an amalgam of some degree of truth or pattern, but also you have to look at who is writing. So if you have an entire group of white people that are writing an Indian character, is that going to necessarily be as representative as if you maybe had at the very least, an Indian person consulting, or a group of Indian people who were representing the Indian person on the show? It's sort of like, the same thing within research, where, the people that are writing research are generally like, the majority of people who write about LGBTQ research and family therapy are straight. And so there is some, credence to that, but at the same time, you need representation at the level of creation, not just at the level of portrayal. Stereotypes are a good way for our brains to be able to like navigate complexity and such, and yeah, you could make the argument that there are some representations that are more simplistic and more problematic than others, and that some are, some try harder and, maybe were consulted about. But again, I'm looking at, do groups of people who are represented by that particular person agree that that's a representation that feels accurate to their experience? And if the general consensus is no, then that's worth listening to. Well, I would agree, Karu. I do think that an audience doesn't necessarily have the right to make demands of the authors, but I do think that viewers have the right to choose whether they consume the information that authors put out there. So I think there's, if you're going to write a character that's designed in tropes that then makes the entire group of people that are represented by that character in that show not watch your show, that's probably telling you something about the way you've written that character. I'm already going to perceive that person in a trope because I haven't seen that person dynamically represented. The way that our brains develop schemas on things is based on our experience, and so if your only experience is that of a stereotype, it's it's a bit of an unrealistic leap to suggest that a person has to understand that there is a level of complexity. Like basically, a teenager or a child doesn't have the actual brain capacity, and their brain is not developed to a point that they can actually take an individual and extract it out and engage in deductive reasoning. They're going to engage in inductive reasoning. So we can hold adults accountable. At the same time, we should also hold adults accountable to represent various groups and identities more dynamically for the sake of others. So, I mean, it's the same concept basically as like, so if you watch the news in Chicago, what you're going to, like, the way that people who are black are often represented are as like, the people you see on the news that are, you see more. Oh man, see, I'm going to get like really, this is hard not to get really political here, but like, when I was growing up, again, in an all-white community, the only black representation I ever saw was on the news where they were talking about like how black people are violent and all this stuff. And so then it creates this trope, and it's the only thing that you operate off of. And then yes, you get all these implicit biases, not your fault. It's the fault of the fact that that's the message that's been sent to you and that you've been exposed to. But that's actually a scenario when we look at representation. Representation is a scenario where it's important to hold systems accountable more so than even individuals. Oh, that's absolutely true, Victoria. But actually, I mean, you can actually, like, that is absolutely true. But actually, like, racism in and of itself is, because it's so, well, covert / overt in the United States, everybody carries some degree of racism. And so actually you see, even in like the gay community, for example, internalized homophobia exists in gay people too, not just in straight people, because of the societal narrative and kind of the way that it's represented. Yeah, absolutely. Internalized homophobia has existed in all groups, not just in straight groups. It's why you see a lot of dissonance within the minds of people who grow up and are gay, because the message that they have seen and the representation they've seen of people who are gay, I mean, that's changing now, but you're at odds with yourself because of the ways that you've seen things represented. So that's where you see people that have an internal sense of dissonance on their own identity, because there's a level of internalized homophobia that's jammed into somebody without them even realizing it, even if they identify in the marginalized group. See, I don't think it's an either or, though. So we often get into these conversations and then it becomes this whole either or of like, either the system has to be held accountable or the individual. Both have to be accountable. So we have to be responsible for our own problems and addressing our biases. We also have to hold the systems accountable for the message that they send that influence our biases. It's not a one-off thing. It's a both and. Not so long as a polarizing character exists in the context of more dynamic characters. Again, if it's the only way that it's represented, then you are doing an entire group of people or an entire identity a disservice by representing it as the only representation that's out there. And that's not necessarily true. So if the only asshole you ever see is somebody who's Vietnamese, and the only representation, I'm just pulling that out of thin air, if all Vietnamese people were, or like the only Vietnamese person that was in any type of like mass out there for mass consumption was an asshole, people that grow up in communities where nobody's Vietnamese are going to internalize that Vietnamese people are assholes. So you can't, like, yes, you can hold individuals accountable for trying to consider the fact that maybe somebody who's Vietnamese might not be an asshole, but at the same time, you need to hold the system accountable for not only representing Vietnamese people as assholes. Again, I completely made that up. Take it at a great assault. So, if that's true, Jex, I'm sorry that was my example. It's just a way of illustrating it. So that's why a diversity and a dynamic level of representation is really important. And so again, I as a white person, as a white guy, the way that I'm represented is super dynamic. I can see a different variation of a white guy every day in everything I watch. But I think about being a gamer. Like, for the longest time, the way gamers were represented was really inaccurate. Like, it used to drive me crazy the way gamers were represented. It was like the whole South Park thing of the guy sitting on the thing with Cheetos on himself, drinking Mountain Dew, And I used to think to myself, like, that doesn't represent me at all. But that's the way that people would interact with me. As soon as I said I was a gamer, I have to carry all the stigma of that because the way that it's represented in the mass media is poorly. Like, You know, it's either I'm a person who's basically equipped to be a mass shooter, or I'm a person who is just this slob with acne all over his face that it can't talk to women. It's why Black Panther was such a big deal. Exactly right, Commander. That's exactly right. And what's interesting is what white people don't really like is that we're starting to be represented more dynamically in a way that's accurate towards being covertly racist. And white people don't like that. But I think that's important too. We need to see more black excellence, and we need to see more white not excellence. The individual holding those expectations problem and not yours. Well, yeah, but I'm the one that ultimately has to bear the burden of that, Karuro, so I would much rather have gamers represented a lot more accurately so that I don't have to constantly fight a stigma every time that people are interacting with me as a gamer. I don't want to have to say that I'm a gamer, but also I'm all these things. Like, I'm more dynamic than that. I'm not just a guy. I play World of Warcraft, but I'm not just a blah, 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 blah. It's understandable why people hold those biases because that's all they ever see, but I don't want to bear the burden of having to constantly justify an identity that I have. Well, that's because there are racist ideals that sort of permeate through our entire society, Florit. And again, it's really easy to think that, people get really activated when they're held accountable to that, but, it's just good to know it. It's really good to acknowledge that, racism's everywhere and that, all of us are racist, because then it allows us to hold ourselves accountable to the times where we might fall into that. No, but Sammy, that was the first, Black Panther is one of the first representations of, where, black people really, there's just this whole range of diversity. And, I look to the people who are being represented to tell me whether it's a good representation or not, and almost universally, black people were like, "Yo, Black Panther is the shit." That's the kind of representation we want, and so I'm going on that. I'm a furry. No, I don't have sex with mascot. Right? Well, no, so exactly. So that's the only I don't know if you're being serious, Sammy, but if you are, it's another really good example. Man, I just got to say, I really appreciate that all of you are willing to engage in this conversation, because this is a conversation that can get you. These last couple nights, I have been just so... I've already think all of you are amazing, but these last couple nights have really, y'all are some wonderful people that we can have these conversations and be respectful to each other and all of that. It's really great. Just wanted to make sure that I said that out loud, because I've been thinking it for a while.